When I came over here, there were 2 ravens in the tree, one of which flew off, the other one didn't fly off. So I kind of waited, and then when it finally flew off, I came over here to see what they were hanging out next to. They were in the tree about 25 feet to my left, but here it looks like there's a carcass, maybe from a squirrel. So it is a gray squirrel, western gray squirrel. There's actually quite a lot of it left, which is interesting. Over here, you can see a lot of fur that's been scattered around, and the carcass has been moved from that location where it may have been resting, because look at the amount of fur that was right there versus down here where it's been moved. It would be very easy for one of the ravens to have moved this, pecking at it, trying to eat it. It looks relatively intact, so a lot of predators would eat it whole. It is a location where a squirrel could have easily fallen out of a tree, and they do on occasion, so that could be what killed it. Let's get a little closer. There's a lot of activity around the carcass with the flies and the wasps and things, but it is a fairly intact carcass, and there's still a lot of meat on this, so it doesn't look like this one was killed by a predator. This squirrel may have just fallen out of a tree. Somebody obviously has been feeding right here. The head has been separated from the spinal column there. Something opened it up and fed on the carcass here. The rest of it's very intact, so this may well be a squirrel that fell out of a tree or died of natural causes, and it just hasn't been scavenged yet, because there's a lot of meat on here. I imagine the ravens will be back to feed on this. There's still plenty of meat here. That's the arm bone, and that's the only part that's been fed on. You can see this disturbance around here in the soil where the ravens have been hanging out doing their feeding. And up here, all this fur probably was plucked out by the predator. Here is some scat. So this is bird scat right here. It's a uric squirt. That's what that white material is. So that tells you that this was probably an avian predator. And it could even be that, this was killed by a hawk, and then the hawk never got a chance to feed before the ravens mobbed it. But it does look like definitely a lot of plucking of the fur has been happening here. They're small clumps. They're really, really tiny. So these are something that a bird could pluck out with its beak and discard. A mammal would be able to just shear it. But a lot of the bigger mammals out here, they would have just fed on this this squirrel, and eaten the thing whole. So I suspect that this was killed by a bird, or it fell out of a tree and was scavenged by the birds, including the ravens that I saw here. Just from the evidence that's here, it looks like that's what happened to this little squirrel. So ravens do like to compete with each other for the food sources that are here. So sometimes you watch them and they're almost fighting over the carcass, and none of them are feeding. So, that could be something that's happening here. I do think this squirrel, either it was a recent kill and it was killed by a bird, an avian predator, or it was natural causes that killed it, and then it was just scavenged by those ravens, because there's not a whole lot of scatter of this stuff, and the carcass hasn't been moved very far from the location where it seems like it was initially plucked. The rest of the hillside just looks kind of undisturbed. I mean, as much as this hillside is, there's a lot of deer feeding sign in here, and they're up here all the time on this hillside, so that's what most of this markings is. But the fresh sign is right there around the carcass, all this disturbed soil right here, and the freshly plucked fur, which was plucked in small quantities. So that's why I'm saying that it was plucked. I think it was done by a bird's beak, and most likely the raven. And I don't know if the raven killed it or if this guy died of natural causes, but either way, it's definitely been scavenged by ravens. So there you go. There's the poor little squirrel. Didn't make it, and it is now feeding the ravens, and the nutrients from this squirrel will go back to feeding the rest of the wildlife here on this location. So when I came over here, there was a raven up in this tree. One of them had flown off. I saw him take off, and then the other one was up in this tree. and wasn't wanting to leave, so I kind of got closer and closer, and finally it left, and then that's when I looked around and ended up finding that carcass of the squirrel. Ravens are kind of like the alarm bells of the forest, and when they're congregating somewhere, there's usually a reason that they're doing that, and especially if they're being very vocal. And in this case, it was because there was food nearby, and they were very interested. So the lesson here is keep an eye on the ravens and kind of watch what they do. Sometimes they can lead you to interesting finds in the forest.